campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Good afternoon. This week and next week we're going to be discussing the issue of nuclear power and nuclear radiation, and in fact the entire area of nuclear issues. On our first program we wish to deal with an organization called the Physicians for Social Responsibility. It is a group of about 7,000 physicians in the United States, which they have as their purpose the willingness to educate first of all the physicians and then health care providers about the medical dangers of nuclear radiation so that they might in turn educate their patients and the general public at large. We're very happy to welcome to our program today to carry out that particular effort Dr. Jeff Hummel, who is a physician in Moscow, Idaho. He received his medical degree from the University of Washington, Seattle, and did his residency at the University of Massachusetts. He is with us today to address our questions concerning health hazards of radiation. Dr. Hummel, welcome to our program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm happy to welcome back as panel members two individuals to assist me in questioning our guests. First of all is Mary Lou Reed, holding a baccalaureate degree from Mills College and did her graduate work in religion at Columbia and has been a panel member for many years with us. Welcome once again, Lou.
Thank you, Tony.
I'm also very happy to welcome to the panel Brian Scott, who is a sophomore at North Idaho College, majoring in the field of pre-med. Brian, welcome.
Thank you, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first series will come from Mary Lou Reed.
Dr. Hummel, as a representative of the Physicians for Social Responsibility, would you start out by giving the facts as you see them about the principal health dangers of radiation, both the natural radiation and man-made?
That's a very complex question, and any answer has to be overly simplified, but I think we talk of ionizing radiation, and what that really means, there's several different forms of energy that can ionize chemical bonds, and we refer to these as ionizing radiation. What really happens is a very high energy particle of light strikes a living organism, we can think of it like this, and tears the electrons off of the atoms in the organism, if it's a single cell or a human being. And when that happens, the chemical bonds are so altered, the electrons take off and they travel distances up to an inch, which is an astronomical distance when you're talking about atomic particles, and what happens is that those bonds are rearranged, and if that bond of the atoms that are damaged happens to be in the DNA, then what we find is genetic damage, which can either cause cancer or cell death, and really it depends on the dosage of radiation, the type of radiation, what the effects will be. But it's you have to understand that it's a level of energy which bonds within biological systems have no way of protecting themselves from. We're talking about energy levels which are thousands of times greater than anything that goes on in normal bonding between atoms in the life process.
That is indeed complex, and you're concerned about making sure that this is understandable to all of us who are not scientists. So perhaps if we walk through a couple of three situations, you can interpret them in terms of health dangers, such as one, nuclear power plants under normal operation. Do you consider this to be a source of dangerous radiation?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question to me, because up until 3 Mile Island, we were talking about the dangers of the nuclear fuel cycle and really not talking at all about the safety of operating plants. That was not even an issue. We just assumed that we had to consider them safe, and we were hoping that they were safe. I happened to be 200 miles directly downwind from 3 Mile Island at the time that mishap occurred, and although I'm not willing to say that a normal operating power plant is giving off large amounts of radiation as it operates in the air, the reality is that the wastes from those nuclear power plants are a problem that there is no solution for in sight. So yes, I see the danger for a normal operating power plant being the accumulation of extremely toxic radioactive waste that there's no satisfactory solution to long-term storage for. In terms of if you walked by or visited a nuclear power plant, as long as you stayed in a safe area, it could be easily determined what your dosage had been. And at a perimeter, the nuclear industry is very fond of saying what the dose will be and pointing out that it's not a significant amount. I might argue that any radiation, even background cosmic ray radiation, causes cancer, causes genetic defects. There's no question about this, and the mechanism is becoming clearer and clearer. So, I mean, that's not the issue. It's simply a matter of what cost, how many cancers per year, per so many people you're willing to accept as a cost for operating power plant.
As a trade-off.
As a trade-off.
Right. How about uranium mining?
Well, that's one of the more dangerous and hazardous aspects of the fuel cycle, as they call it. It's not really a cycle. It's more
the total picture.
Yeah,
it's
a total
involved,
picture,
yeah.
right. And usually what happens is that the miners who are either working in open pit mines or in tunnel mines are inhaling air which has been contaminated with not only uranium dust, but also uranium breaks down into a number of lesser, well, I should say it breaks down into decay products, some of which are gases, radon gases, which then can be inhaled. Particles can be deposited in the lungs, and what that can lead to is radioactive particles which are giving off their radiation of different forms inside a person's lung along the airway lining. The lung cancer rates among uranium miners, as well as the European pitchblende miners back in the 1800s, were very high. The Germans had a word for it. They called it Bergkrankheit, I think, but in any event, it meant mountain sickness, and it was lung cancer. It was what the miners got up in the mines from breathing radioactive dust and air.
Let me just toss out another example as a way of sort of structuring this or bringing it to scale. The increased use of medical x-rays, is this something that which your group is trying to bring out as a hazard?
Well, that issue comes up, and it is important. There's no question that if you look at where the American public is getting irradiated from, that medical x-rays that are given either in physicians' offices or in hospitals constitute a significant fraction of that. And I think that what's happening now is that, number one, the technology of those x-ray machines is improving such that we're able to get the diagnostic information which is necessary in a given situation at lower and lower doses. That's one thing. Second thing is we're adopting fairly strict criteria as to when x-rays are ordered. The bottom line comes down to thinking of x-rays as a trade-off, as a risk. And if you suspect a broken arm or a broken spine or something, there's no question you'll get the x-rays. So really the question comes down to, number one, what question is being asked when the x-ray is obtained? And number two, how will the results of that x-ray change your therapy? If it won't change the therapy, you may be able to decide that the x-ray is not necessary. If it's not going to, if you're just screening, then you have to have very strict protocols as to what is an adequate trade-off for a screen, and a lot of screening x-rays are being dropped.
I'm taking too much time, but could I say that a quick summary of this question is that you're primarily concerned with the whole question of cumulative effects of additional radiation coming in?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Brian Scott.
Okay, Dr. Hummel, what I want to ask you is, well, most people don't realize that the thermonuclear blast of an atomic bomb is not the most devastating part of it. It's the radiation that follows afterwards. Could you give us some symptoms of radiation sickness which correspond to different...
Well, I would first argue with you. I think that even if there were no after effects of radiation, that the thermonuclear blast effects would probably kill more people in a war, in an exchange. I think it's very important for people to understand the extreme devastation that a thermonuclear blast would cause, and I'd be very glad to talk about that. As far as the long-term effects of radiation, it does depend on the dose. We're talking about several situations. Number one, people who are outside the immediate blast area for, say, an aerial burst, and were not killed either by blast effects or heat, but did get a radiation dose like the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. Those people would suffer effects that were dose dependent, and we talk in terms of rads as being a unit for external radiation dosage. It's a spectrum of doses, and just to give you an idea of where things fall along that line, background radiation from cosmic rays is somewhere in the order of, depending on where you live, of course, is going to be on the order of 1/10 of a rad per year. Medical x-rays may give you, for say a chest x-ray, maybe 1/10 of a rad. Maybe it depends on the film, the thickness of the person, the type of machine that's used. It may be up to 1/2 a rad or even a whole rad for some abdominal series. Now, people who receive that dose would probably not have any effects. If you talk about what it takes to kill people, it's generally agreed that between 300 and 400 rads of external radiation will cause about a 50% mortality. So people who received that immediately, about 50% of those people would die primarily from bone marrow failure at about 2 to 3 weeks out. Higher doses that were received immediately would cause, the highest doses would cause almost instant, well, I shouldn't say instant, but within several hours, brain death from swelling and destruction of the nerve tissues. Below that dose, somewhere around 600, 700, 800 rads, there would be sloughing of the gastrointestinal lining, which would then cause an intractable fluid loss, and a person would die from that. Now, in areas that were contaminated by fallout, which would be more heavy in a ground burst, say against a strategic site, like in this case, we're downwind from the stuff in western Washington, the Bangor Trident base and things like this. There would be a terrific amount of fallout, and one way to think of it is Mount St. Helens, in terms of blast and fallout, was probably equivalent to about a 4 megaton ground burst. We would be seeing a similar amount of debris coming down for each bomb that went off at ground level downwind, only instead of just being volcanic ash, it would be highly radioactive. And the people who lived in that area would suffer from radiation sickness, again, according to how many rads that they received from contact. The thing to remember is it would not be a single dose. It would be a continuous exposure to this high-level radiation, so it would probably render the entire area uninhabitable.
So you're saying that thermonuclear blast would kill more people than the radiation, even if you took into consideration all the deaths it caused 5 years, 10 years after?
You know, that's a real hard question to answer. Estimates for an all-out nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States run somewhere around a 50% mortality immediately for the United States. There would probably be somewhere between 75 and 125,000 short-term casualties. The survivors then would be in that limbo space of trying to survive without a social structure, without a food supply, depending on the time of year, any number of climatologic changes, the diseases that not only would there no longer be a medical system to provide health care and treatment for types of diseases which are now easily cured, but our immune systems, this is something I didn't mention in terms of radiation dose, but the immune system, which protects us from bacterial infection, viral infections, would be severely damaged. And so we would probably see survivors having a much lower resistance to bacterial infections. And I think we could count on there being waves of epidemics of everything from tuberculosis and dysentery to plague and cholera, this type of thing. I think we would very quickly find ourselves back in the Dark Ages medically. I can't answer your question, which would cause more deaths. I think that it's been agreed from everybody from Khrushchev through the leaders of of the Physicians for Social Responsibility that the survivors would envy the dead, and I don't see any reason to dispute that personally.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've joined our program in progress, our guest today is Dr. Jeff Hummel, who is a member of a national organization called Physicians for Social Responsibility. He's with us today to discuss radiation and its health hazards, as you can tell from the discussion if you've tuned in the last few minutes. Dr. Hummel, I would like to continue along the lines that Brian and Lou have been asking you. Since we do not really have any examples, any lab experiences about radiation from nuclear weapons, other than the World War II experience that was much more limited than what it would be today, in an article that you wrote, and Brian was asking you about it, you've been very honest and tried to explain to us what the blast itself would do in a city such as Seattle, and what would be the effect around the area later and then disease. But is there really anyone that could say with any assurance that if there was all-out war between the Soviet Union and the United States, and we use the potential we have, if the planet at all would be inhabited following that over a period of time? I'm thinking about such areas that I'd like you to address as the ozone and what it would do to that. Is there any chance for life to even survive?
Hard to say. It's real hard to say. The physicists like to talk in terms of the model of On the Beach. I think that was a movie that a lot of us saw in the early 60s or late 50s. It was a hypothetical situation of an all-out nuclear exchange, and it took place in Australia as the radioactive cloud from the northern hemisphere circled the globe and snuffed out life further and further south. Some hypothetical studies have been done to try to figure out what it would take for one On the Beach to occur, or one beach as the unit would be. We're now somewhere in the neighborhood of, in terms of the total total world nuclear arsenal, in terms of approximately 50,000 nuclear weapons in both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, of about somewhere between a tenth and a fifth of a beach, okay? And all it will take is for the arms race to continue at its present rate for another 10 years, and we'll be coming very close to that. So now, that assumes that we know what the effects of an all-out nuclear exchange right now would be. I think that in terms of, like you mentioned, the effects on the ozone, nobody can say with absolute certainty what it would do to the ozone layer, but the physicists who are talking about this make a prediction that it would drastically alter the ozone layer. We would probably see a dramatic increase in blindness. It might very well put eyes, as they've evolved to this point, out of commission, to where people could not walk around without dark glasses. That would have not only a devastating effect on survivors, but it would basically eliminate life above a bacterial level. It would be really hard to imagine that all life on this planet would be snuffed out. I think it would probably push it back to an area where we would have to give evolution a chance, a few billion years, to try again. As far as I'm concerned, that's almost an unthinkable consequence, and yet I think it has to be looked at squarely as within the realm of possibility.
Before we turn to the panel, I have one other area that dealing with radiation that's not been addressed, and you did that earlier today with the students, and that's the question of the food chain, and that even if we do not have that terrible day of atomic war or nuclear war, that if we have the wrong type of policies and radiation, that it could be in our food chain, and that could affect the human race in a very serious way. Would you address the question of how that could happen?
Well, that experiment's really been done. I mean, those of us who grew up or who lived through the 50s and the early 60s are, I like to think of us as the fallout generation. We are the ones who really saw the experiment done. There were several test sites in addition to the Nevada test site, which has gained some notoriety because of the high rates of leukemia and cancers and the people downwind from that. But in addition to that, there's a large body of literature in the health physics field in which the fallout was studied, and it was studied carefully. The Olympic Peninsula was an area which was quite a laboratory because it was not only did it get the winds coming off the Pacific from the Pacific test range, but also there was fallout from the Soviet Union. Most of the Soviet fallout came down in the Arctic, and there was a point in the late 50s and early 60s where it was felt unsafe to eat the caribou for the Eskimos to continue hunting caribou, and so food was flown up to them for a period of time. In the Olympic situation, it was felt that the elk there, although they were more contaminated than the caribou in Alaska, were probably not a major food source for the Olympic Peninsula people. And I think probably that most people who lived at that time on the peninsula were not aware of what was going on, and yet it was a perfect laboratory for the scientists to study what happened to the more short-lived radionuclides as they came down in the rain, as they were stopped by the canopy of leaves and then washed through. And there were seasonal cycles that had to do with not only the amount of testing going on at that time, but also the rain cycle and the seasons. And it was quite easy to trace certain elements through the lichens and mosses then into the animals which fed on those. One particular study that caught my attention was done in some lakes that I had been hiking in at the age of 12, I think, back in 1961 or 2. In any event, it was in Colorado, and there was a study done in which the cesium concentrate, the radioactive cesium and strontium levels in the meat of mountain trout in this particular chain of lakes that happened to be studied was many times in excess what was in meat down in the Denver supermarkets. And although they hastened to assure the readers that there was no reason to be worried, and that may or may not be the case, that's not something I can really address. The point is that the mechanism for concentration of many of these longer-lived radionuclides in the food chain is very, very clear. Cesium is recognized by the body as potassium and is taken up by the gut. It is shunted to the intracellular fluid, much the way the potassium is. Strontium looks, as far as our internal organs are concerned, it looks like calcium, and so it's stashed in the bones. And so there's mechanisms for concentrating its uptake from the gut. Mm-hmm. And this is true, each individual radionuclide has its own way of being handled in biologic systems, and it's only been through experiments that it's become clear.
Lou Reed.
Grim, isn't it, that we all seem to be so intent upon poisoning ourselves in so many different ways, not only nuclear but chemical, and it's a tremendous amount of pressure upon the human body.
As much as pressure on the human body, it's a pressure on the human mind. I look around me and I see an amazing array of denial mechanisms for people avoiding looking at this issue and taking responsibility for it. And those denial mechanisms range everywhere from making plans to survive a nuclear war. The survivalists are stocking up their food and guns to survive the war. I think that's a blatant denial mechanism. I think saying, well, we can't do anything about it, that's a denial mechanism too. What do I care? I'm just living for today. I see that as a denial mechanism too. And I think the people who say, well, it probably won't happen, that may be wishful thinking more than anything else. And I just see psychological denial mechanisms
How do you
everywhere.
psych out the pro-nuclear people, the nuclear industry? What there is, do you consider that a denial too?
I see the nuclear industry as either totally intertwined with the arms industry or else a front for it. I'm not quite sure. Economically, the nuclear power is not making it. I mean, it can't. It's the only way it's gotten this far is with just an amazing amount of federal subsidies, and if you don't. So it doesn't really make much sense economically. There are a lot of people, very dedicated people, who have their careers tied up in this particular technology, and we live in times when it's very hard to find work. And someone who has a secure job doing, you've got to admit, nuclear physics is extremely interesting, and it's actually an incredible field. And I think also there's a real desire to turn this technology, which was so clearly abused in the building of the bomb and has gotten so out of control in the arms race. There's a real strong desire in most people to think that their lives have been working towards something good, and I think that there's a real need for nuclear physicists to see nuclear power as the way of taking this incredible power which has been abused, is being abused, and turn it into something wonderful for the human race. It's very hard to break that shell and get people to wake up and say, you know, we are going further and further down a very, very dangerous road. We can make it quite well without nuclear power. There's no way to have nuclear power without also having nuclear weapons, and we cannot live with nuclear weapons. We just will not make it.
We don't hear much about deterrence anymore. You're suggesting that there still is a validity in that kind of thinking, that nuclear weapons can be used to assure that life will go on. We don't hear that as much. That's sort of a 10-year ago kind of argument. What we hear now is concern for proliferation, and the other countries who want to have the bomb, sort of like this is going to give them right to vote or something like that.
It's hard to know what's going to happen. I see these few years right now at the beginning of the 80s as really the turning point. We will either, the arms race has been held in check by the threat of mutually assured destruction between the United States and the Soviet Union, which means that they know that if we attack them, they can wipe out our population, and we know it too, and the same goes in reverse. That balance is being very threatened at this point because of new technologies which make a first strike much more attractive to one side or the other. The U.S. is leading the technology in this case, as it has in every other leap of the arms race, so I think it's important to realize that.
Brian, we have time for a short question.
What do you think about the health hazards of a breeder reactor at the Southern Idaho Engineering?
Well, it's a complicated question. The physicists assure us that breeder reactors, in fact, cannot explode like a bomb. I've heard it from both sides. I think the most important thing is, number one, it makes plutonium. And the only purpose of having a breeder reactor is to make plutonium for using either in bombs or in a fuel cycle in a plutonium burning reactor. What you're talking about is a plutonium economy, and the cost of that in terms of the types of safeguards that would be necessary to keep the plutonium from being made into small bombs by terrorist groups. The political costs of that would be just astronomical. The health costs in terms of spillage of plutonium into the environment, that's been worked out fairly carefully on a hypothetical scale by John Goffman, who's a physician. It's just unacceptable.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're out of time.
Okay.
Dr. Hummel, thank you. It's been most informative today.
Okay, it's been my pleasure.
Thank you, panel, for outstanding questions. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed our program, and you'll be with us again next week when we will have two other guests that will deal with the question of radiation and what's happening on this very, very important topic. I hope you have a nice week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.